Well, hello, everyone. My name is Judy Morgan, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion. Before we start the program, I just wanted to cover a bit of technical information. If you're finding your internet quality is poor, click on the click here to refresh stream, which is just below the video player, to view the webinar at a lower bandwidth. The video quality will decrease, but the audio should remain the same. If you're having any other technical issues, click on Request Help bubble, which is on the bottom right corner of the webcast page. Your help request will be emailed back to you at the email address you provided when you registered. Today's session is being recorded and will be available for viewing after the session ends. Even though we're meeting virtually today, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, and Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I am the chair of the Intergovernmental Committee for Economic and Labor Force Development, which for obvious reasons we short form to ICE. More information about the committee is on our website, which is www.icecommittee.org. In a nutshell, what we do is facilitate collaboration among all three orders of government around economic and labor force development in Toronto. Our goal is to break down the silos and facilitate information sharing and collaboration across government. Our members include representatives from about a dozen different offices at the City of Toronto, Province of Ontario, and federal government. Our activities are made possible by the financial support of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada and the City of Toronto Economic Development and Culture Division. Our activities include identifying topics of collective interest around which we commission research and host forums such as today's event. One of our ICE members, Christine Carrasco, is going to tell you more about today's event. But before I turn the screen over to her, I just want to bring your attention to two important features on the event page. The first is the questions tab to the right of the viewing screen. You may ask a question at any time during the webcast by clicking on it, typing in your question and clicking submit. If you'd like to direct your questions to a specific person, please include that information as well. And we will be addressing your questions at after the speakers have made their presentations. The second feature is the link to our feedback survey, which is a colored text beside the viewing page. I promise you that the survey is really short and we do use our feedback in planning future events. So we would really appreciate your cooperation in filling out the survey before you sign out of the webinar, or you can click back and do it afterwards if that's more convenient. So without further ado, over to you, Christine.
Great, thank you, Judy. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you virtually as today's event moderator. My name is Christine Carrasco, and I'm a manager of workforce development with Toronto Employment and Social Services, or TESS, as you may know us. We are the division in the City of Toronto that is responsible for the administration of Ontario Works. This is a provincial program that provides financial benefits, employment supports, and social service supports to many low-income residents of the City of Toronto. I've also been a member of the ICE committee for close to 2 years, and I've had the pleasure in this capacity to work with a number of colleagues across various government departments and orders of government to help shape very important research questions and initiatives such as the one we're launching today. And of course, a core component, as Judy mentioned, of ICE is to promote various forms of networking and information sharing. So I've had the unique pleasure to be a part of that process for 2 years. I want to begin by echoing Judy's welcome and by thanking all of the speakers today. So Tom Zizis and Adriana Beemans, thank you for being here today, and to our virtual audience for participating. I can't see exactly who's on the line right now, but I trust that we have a very good turnout. The last time we checked the registration list, we had a really good lineup of participants representing a number of different organizations, including planning boards, various orders of government, community organizations, and various industry stakeholders. So thank you. It really does highlight the importance of today's event and the research that is cross-cutting across this. I also want to say thank you to ICE for hosting the event, for fostering important relationships and sponsoring this work, and to our funders, of course, mentioned already by Judy. So why are we here? I think all of you received the event information and have had a chance perhaps to skim the main feature report for today's event. And I'll start by saying that there's no question that over recent years, there's been a lot of worrisome long-term trends in the labor market that keep us up at night. This is true globally, not just for Toronto. It includes things like precarious work, the rise of gig work or the gig economy, the increase in working poverty and income inequality, and the threats posed by things like digitization, automation, and artificial intelligence. We know also that the impact of these trends has been disproportionately felt among many marginalized groups and those working in lower skilled occupations. Just to give you an example, or several examples actually, unfortunately, women, youth, racialized groups, Indigenous folks, and immigrants and newcomers are disproportionately impacted by some of these trends. Over the last 20 months, COVID has certainly exacerbated these trends, and I think we can all appreciate that the impacts of this pandemic will have a lasting impact on the economy and for the various support systems that are in place in community to support these marginalized populations. That being said, there are some unique opportunities on the horizon, I think, to work differently and to tackle some of these big problems. One of these opportunities is the province's plans to transform employment services in Ontario. So if you're unaware about this process, I really encourage all of you to take a look into the province's plans. There's a lot of information out there on this, and today's presentation will get into some of it. But essentially, this provincial transformation plan will see the integration of a number of employment service systems, primarily the employment assistance programs offered through Ontario Works and ODSP, or Ontario Disability Support Program, and the Employment Ontario Employment Services Program. The intent is for this future system to be managed by a single service system manager for the Toronto area, and to select that service system manager through a competitive process. And what we also know now is that the province has set forward a plan that will see the implementation of the SSM, or Service System Manager model, for Toronto for late 2023. So it's within this context of the labor market and some of these opportunities on the horizon that the ICE committee saw a unique opportunity to commission important research to look at setting a foundation to inform future directions for Toronto with respect to workforce development, and to help inform conversations among relevant government and ecosystem partners within it that takes into consideration some of these changes. I'm pleased to say that Tom, who is here with us today, was the successful proponent of this work, and his report, which is accessible through the ICE committee webpage, forms the basis of today's event. So without taking Tom's thunder away, I will say a few things that I think stood out for me in this report, and really some takeaways, I think, for folks on the line to pay attention to as you work through this report and hear Tom's presentation. The report, of course, provides very important information on Toronto's landscape, some of the transformation initiatives that I just mentioned. It also provides really good definitional clarity on workforce development and employment services as concepts. These are often used interchangeably, and very important for folks who are immersed in this work to keep some of these definitional issues top of mind as we think about our work. It also provides really great up-to-date information on labor market trends, which take on a bit of an equity lens, looking at who's most impacted by some of the various trends taking place, and some of the outcomes of these systems. And most importantly, the report lays out some arguments for working with employers differently, and also placing greater emphasis on those individuals who are most furthest from the labor market. And as the title of today's event suggests, the report identifies considerations for developing an agenda for Toronto that takes a look at some of those upcoming opportunities and some of the key challenges faced by our region. What I can say from a City of Toronto government lens is that the report has already been very instrumental in helping shape and inform key conversations within the city. The city through council has actually recommended earlier this year that we begin to plan around how we best support residents in this transformed system, and also report back to council on whether or not the city will pursue the role of SSM for Toronto. Not to say that this is the focus of today, but just to give you a sense of how this report is really helping shape conversations across various orders of government and institutions. So we hope today is really just a starting point for ongoing collaboration. We are really eager to continue these conversations. Happy, I think I speak for all of the panelists here and from ICE that we are happy to hear from you. So please feel free to reach out to the ICE committee for more information and to further engage on this topic. So I am now going to hand it over to Tom to walk us through his keynote presentation. But before I do, I am going to introduce Tom and Adriana and provide you with a little bit of context with respect to how we're going to plan out today's event. So Tom Zizis is a Toronto-based consultant who has worked in the public and nonprofit sectors for over 25 years. For the last 15 years, he has specialized in labor market issues, undertaking labor market data analysis, designing, training, and employment projects, and providing broader commentary on trends and policy frameworks related to employment and workforce development programs. So thank you, Tom, for being here today. And just to simplify things, I'm going to take this minute to also introduce Adriana, who will follow Tom's keynote. So Adriana Beemans is the Inclusive Local Economies Program Director at the Metcalf Foundation, where she is focused on creating sustainable economic opportunities for low-income people in Toronto. As a grant maker, Adriana works closely with community partners to advance labor market strategies to reduce poverty, innovative approaches for community wealth, and community organizing for structural change. So welcome, Adriana, as well. So I'm now going to turn it over to Tom, who will be followed by Adriana, and then we'll have some time for questions on both presentations. So over to you, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Christine. Thank you to the ICE committee for selecting me to undertake this project, and for providing an opportunity to make this presentation to a wider audience. And I'd also like to thank the participants here, the attendees to this webinar. As Christine mentioned, we know there's a fairly large number of people who signed up, so I'm really gratified to know that this topic is of interest to a wide range of participants. So I'm going to provide a little bit of an outline of the presentation. Mohammed, I'm going to ask if I can get the slides onto my screen because I'm going to be following them. Okay, now I have it. Okay, great, terrific. Because I will be lost without my presentation. So the presentation is going to be relatively simple. I want to talk about the concept of workforce development. I want to provide some of the labor market rationale, particularly in terms of, as Christine mentioned, some of the longer term trends that have happened in the labor market for why we might want to look to workforce development as one of the ways to advance better outcomes, both in economic outcomes, but also social and equity outcomes. And following that, to talk about how that might influence or how that has a bearing on how we look at workforce development in Toronto, as well as the question of the Employment Ontario transformation and the service system manager initiative that's going to be taking place in 2023. So when I was doing this work, my initial expectation was that I would be talking about the looking at best practices around workforce development. So part of my work involved a literature review, looking at the last 5 or 10 years of different reports that are coming from different jurisdictions. And one of the things that really struck me was that the term workforce development was actually used in many different ways, and it really depended on the context. And so that's what led to a good portion of this report, really just looking at, well, what do we mean by workforce development and how is it used by different stakeholders and players in the labor market field? So I'm going to start with distinguishing between workforce development and employment services, because typically those, someone's very insistent on connecting with me. Those different organizations that undertake employment services often characterize themselves as being part of workforce development, and they are. But there are very great differences between what employment services does and what we typically think of when we talk about workforce development. So employment services are, I would characterize as kind of a retail part of services that are focused on labor market outcomes. It's typically helping with an individual who's looking for employment. It's often done one-on-one in that there's a client that's to be helped. The major part of the service has to do with helping that individual acquire the skills for finding employment. So how to understand where to look for work, how to present oneself as a job candidate in terms of one's resume, in terms of interviews, to provide some assistance, provide some tools in terms of that job search activity, sometimes by linking an individual with a particular employment, and sometimes providing also some transition from where that person is to being job ready. So what we might call pre-employment support around particularly basic literacy skills or understanding what the expectations of the workplace are. Whereas for me, workforce development more often involves a process, that it's not an individual outcome in terms of placement in a job, but it's developing an opportunity for a career, linking an individual to employment, but also to a career path. And more often that's done through a collection of individuals, a group of job seekers linking up and being prepared for employment that might exist among a group of employers. So the employer part becomes important, because getting an understanding of what the employers are looking for in a particular field informs what those individuals are being prepared for. And so in order to get a deeper understanding of a particular sector, workforce development initiatives tend to be sector focused, because the intelligence around one industry is going to be different about another in terms of what their skill expectations are, what their career pathways may be, and what opportunities may exist in a particular locale. Workforce development will often work in alignment with employment services, so they can be an adjunct or a component of the workforce development. But I want to try and begin by making that distinction between employment services and workforce development. The other part, though, is again, as I was looking at the literature, is one finds that even as one focuses on workforce development as kind of a process to access careers and to access advancement within a particular sector, I found that the literature was divided between two categories of studies. One was focusing on those individuals who are further from the labor market, so those that might have some barriers to employment or to sustained employment or to career pathways, and what I will call talent. So talent involves, from the viewpoint of employers, those individuals who are very critical to the success of an organization, typically talking about senior management positions or professionals or individuals with highly technical skills. And as we started making a transformation in the 80s and 90s from companies developing workers from their entry-level positions and having internal career ladders that led to more semi-skilled positions or supervisory positions or management positions, as we went from that internal career advancement within firms to a more expectation of hiring individuals who already have credentials, employers already started distinguishing between the different categories of workers. And for them, the talent category was, as I said, the critical piece of their equation in terms of their business success. And for several decades now, we've seen that companies have tended to invest far more of their human resources into individuals in that talent category. And those who typically have university education are ones who will also receive far more of the training that takes place within a particular company. And so this distinction starts becoming important because we really are talking about two different ends of the labor market, between those who are further from being job ready and talent, which is at the high end of the labor market. So let's look a bit more about this talent category, because it expresses itself in a number of ways. First of all, the HR practices of the firm itself, as I mentioned, they will tend to invest more in terms of the training dollars that are provided to this category of workers. They take on the function or a role of being learning organizations, where they are striving to constantly improve their processes and improve this category of worker. And they spend much more time ensuring that they select the right candidates for these jobs. So whereas before one might have, the important thing was to attract workers who might expect a lifelong employment with a firm, now screening individuals and ensuring that they're the exact right fit for a job is a large part of the effort that's spent in terms of identifying the right workforce for an employer. Partly that then shows itself in terms of how much longer the hiring process is, or if you're a job candidate, you find yourself going through a series of interviews and an extended process before you're selected for a job. At the same time, individuals who are either job candidates or already working in a firm, there's a far greater expectation placed on those individuals to ensure that, to encourage them to constantly be improving themselves. This is a notion of lifelong learning, that being in a job is not enough. And even if you're learning on the job, that you should be trying to always be updating your skills, to be attending professional development courses or getting other certificates or even further degrees while you're working, so that you're very current in terms of the expectations that attach to your occupation. A lot of this is often self-directed, that particularly as a job seeker, like trying to understand what is industry looking for. So we have various resources that now are available to individuals so they can chart their career paths. It's as if, individuals become their own human resources development office. More recently, a lot of that has become very technology enabled. So we have various platforms for identifying what are the skills that are necessary for various occupations, what are the next rung, what is the next rung in the occupational ladder that you are in, what are the kinds of certificates you need to advance. All these now you can do the research on the internet, and there's an industry that exists just to support this individual lifelong learning function. And I describe some of this as being part of a broader technology paradigm. With the IT revolution that's taken place and the computer revolution that's taken place over the last couple of decades, we've gotten used to an expectation of rapid change and disruption, and everything happened at a fast pace, and a need for constant improvement. I describe it as we're always having to update our software. There's always a new version coming out, and we're expecting the same of individuals, that they have to consistently almost prove themselves in order to stay where they are in terms of their career or to advance. And that is part of kind of almost a whole paradigm of viewing how the labor market operates. But I think, to a large extent, it actually only describes one portion of the labor market, and particularly that related to what I would call this talent field. And so I shade this to say this is this whole constellation of perspectives is what I would call is kind of a skills agenda. That there's a far greater concentration on skills and the need to constantly upgrade skills because of this perspective, because of this paradigm. And for me, when I look at the various players who are involved, there's a set of stakeholders who are much more engaged and invested in this part of the labor market and in viewing labor market challenges as a skills issue. And so I would include, economic development offices, I would include academia, major consulting firms that provide HR assistance and supports to employers. And I found it interesting that when COVID hit, and as we were starting to think about what the implications of COVID are, that one of the early perspectives that were being advanced through the literature was that, well, we're going to need more upskilling and we're going to need reskilling, that every single issue is viewed as a skills problem. That as opposed to, for example, we, so many people in professional jobs pivoted, that's one of the words of this paradigm, pivoted to working from home. And in fact, there was hardly much training, like this happened kind of instantaneously. We didn't have to start attending workshops and training programs in order to make what was quite an incredible migration of thousands of people working from an office to working from home. Like we, by and large, I think most of us would say we figured it out. But in this paradigm, it's always a challenge that we're gonna miss out on improving our processes if we don't constantly improve our skill set. The other thing I'll also just mention in this context, that equity issues of the sort that were raised by Black Lives Matters or by various protest movements and other activist events that took place over the last year or two, in this paradigm gets more expressed in terms of a goal of diversity. And the diversity goal, while I appreciate that it's also being motivated by intentions of equity, much of it gets expressed as a business advantage, so that the diversity intent is promulgated by showing that diverse teams make better decisions, or diverse organizations, especially those that are customer facing, can give the diverse consumer audience a sense that they are reflected in that company. That the way in which anything is done is typically tied to a business goal or a business intent. All right, so having talked about the talent side, let me move over to the other side, which is what I call further from the labor market. So I've numbered this because, as you can see, this slide starts getting so busy that I want to have an ability to draw your attention to different parts of this slide on the left-hand side. So further from the labor market, looking at that number one, first of all, as I said before, employment services are often there to provide assistance for those individuals who have greater challenges in terms of accessing jobs. So it's already a self-selected group in a sense that this is not a group that necessarily can undertake these activities on their own. They may not always know how to look for work. They may have had barriers in terms of their attachment to the labor market. They may have certain skill deficits that need to be supported. So employment services, in addition to helping, as I said before, around the job search function, will at times provide the kind of transition to the employment sphere by providing employment preparation or pre-employment programs that reintroduce to individuals a sense of what the expectations of the employment place are like. There may be need for some support with essential skills, so literacy and numeracy, wraparound services. So there may be other challenges in a person's life that need to be stabilized so that they can participate in the labor market, and sometimes need some individual support, coaching, mentoring in order to succeed. But that collection of services are actually under the employment services umbrella is relatively limited in terms of how it's funded, that it's often something that is not as accessible or not as accessible to the wide range of individuals who may require that kind of support. Workforce development, and I'm sorry, I guess the other thing I'll say is that in terms of the employment services, it's very supply side focused. So the labor supply, the individual looking for employment, is the one who's particularly targeted in terms of this perspective, right? Workforce development understands that, but takes the view that we need to see what the employers are seeking, and then match the development of the individual to what that workplace requires in terms of skills, in terms of both technical skills and soft skills that would be necessary for the job. But that being said, there's also, if the goal is to support longer term career success, then it's also important to do certain screening in terms of identifying pathways that lead to sustainable employment, to better career opportunities. But it also means not only taking what employers are offering, but actually working with employers to improve their own human resources practices around, say, job retention, but also some of the other business models that they use that may make the job not as appealing. Like if you can only be guaranteed part-time work, or if your hours are unpredictable, then that raises a greater difficulty for individuals who are responding to the whims of that workplace, trying to overcome the challenges of having precarious work is part of the agenda of workforce development. And as I mentioned before, that being able to engage with employers in a deeper way, both in terms of understanding what their expectations are, what the various occupations that they employ, what are the skill needs, being able to provide training programs that target those occupations, more typically require working with employers who are in a similar situation. So that's why we talk about sector strategies in workforce development. Now, at the moment when this report was written, I think it's important to kind of remind people that this report was written in March of 2021. That at that time, I was also trying to make the argument for why workforce development is particularly important now, or of specific relevance now. And one was, as Christine had mentioned, was the Employment Ontario transformation and the introduction of what will be a service system manager. I'm not going to get into great detail about the implications of the service system manager, but certainly one of the important changes that are going to take place in terms of employment services is that the proportion of individuals who have greater barriers, who are more at risk of being long-term unemployed, there is a there's going to be a shift in terms of where employment services are going to be putting their efforts, and a far higher proportion of individuals who have higher needs and greater challenges in terms of accessing employment are going to be the focus of employment services. In my view, what employment services have typically done has not been able to help that category of individuals. I'd say, if I had to do a rough estimation, I'd say that perhaps 35% of people who get served under Employment Ontario higher level support of services are those who might have, who are at greater risk of being long-term unemployed. I will say that under the SSM model that is going to be rolling out, that proportion is going to be around 50 or 55 or 60 or 65% of the caseload, which means I think the usual job search skills and job matching function that employment services do will not be enough in order to get the results that are expected. And that's one of the arguments for why we will need to see more workforce development. At the same time, and I'll have some slides following this on the data, but we are seeing that this category of worker is a smaller share of our labor force. They're less involved in the labor market, and with an aging population, we can also expect to see more labor shortages as we have a higher proportion of individuals who are retiring. So what's also happened, of course, since then, since March, as we've seen in this fall, is in fact, so many employers are expressing the complaint that they can't find workers, that as businesses are opening up, as particularly in the services sector, they can't maintain even the level of business that they used to operate before at, because they can't get enough workers. So this issue of labor shortage has become even more prominent. And partly, I will say, I think there's good reason to say that it partly has to do with some of the employment practices that have long existed in these among these jobs in the food and accommodation sector and the retail sector, of being jobs that are part-time, low wage, unpredictable hours, fewer opportunities for career advancement, and perhaps not always the best HR practices on the part of employers. So this labor shortage issue is even, as I said, that much more pronounced. But also as part of, what the COVID experience brought to the fore was the inequitable way that the pandemic impacted society, that individuals who were in marginalized jobs or who were in marginalized neighborhoods or who worked in jobs that were low skilled and low paid were the ones who were most affected in terms of their employment, and were also the ones who were most affected in terms of the incidence of COVID infections and COVID deaths. And so for me, the COVID moment kind of just highlighted what has been the inequitable outcomes of our labor markets for the last couple of decades. I will say that COVID has brought up issues on reskilling, but I'm going to tell you that in my view, it's actually, that's the less important issue in terms of assisting individuals in this category of need to gain access to employment. I think it has far more to do in terms of overcoming various barriers to employment around employability skills and so on, and far less around the skills issue. And I say this because and that's why I've highlighted this thing about this whole lifelong learning paradigm. We have the focus that we have on the talent issue is one that tends to not monopolize, but let's say is a large voice in when we start describing what the labor market issues are and what are the solutions to overcoming them. If the view is that it's a skills issue, then the attention is going to be placed on developing programs that provide various short-term training programs in order to move people into employment. Whereas, my argument would be that in fact we need a way to address the range of issues that individuals have in terms of stabilizing their lives, in terms of providing them with a sense of confidence and knowing that they have the support in order to not only access a job, but be assisted in the job as they're finding their feet in the labor market. So for me, there's always a bit of a pushback against, I want to kind of ensure that, I want to make sure that people understand that to some extent, the skills conversation is for a different part of the labor market. In fact, the degree to which technology has impacted jobs that typically require a high school diploma or less is far less than the impact that technology has had and the skill expectations on jobs that require a college or university or trade certificate. Okay, let me keep going here. One of the things I was talking about around workforce development was this focus on the demand side. And I wanted to unpack that a bit further because I think there's a tendency to think to limit our ambition in terms of what we think about when we talk about employer engagement. And so I wanted to provide a kind of spectrum here of a low level and high level of interaction with employers. And I've given different terms to characterize it. So the first one is what I'd call employer sensitive. So what I mean by that is that the service provider is looking to find out, well, what's the employer looking for in terms of a job candidate. So our employment services, the degree to which they engage with employers tends to be more just transactional. It's like, You're looking for a job candidate. Tell us what the job requirements are, and we'll get you the candidate. And then that's kind of the end of the relationship. Okay. Some of that information they may not even get directly. They may get indirectly, looking at job ads, looking at summaries of what the trends are in terms of where there are job openings. So for me, if we're talking about employer engagement, that's kind of, you're just being employer sensitive. Okay, you're including their considerations into your decision making. Most of current workforce development, in my view, is what I call employer-led. They say, you know what, the employer sets the terms. We're responding to what the marketplace wants or needs, and we're going to provide it. So it's really important to have employers as advisors sitting on the design of what these training programs look like, being part of focus groups to provide the detailed information about what, specific skill sets that individuals need. And that's, and I think that's the extent to which much of our current workforce development activities focus on. I'd say there's a third piece, which is what I call employer engage, where we're not only having an impact in terms of how the supply side is changing, how individuals are changing their skills, are changing their attitudes towards the workplace, but we're also engaging with employers about changing the workplace itself around what do we mean by a decent job? What do we mean in terms of what are the benefits of a living wage, and how that has a bearing on the success of the company in terms of by having higher retention rates, there's lower turnover, there's lower transactional costs that take place when there's a high turnover in a workplace. So I just wanted to kind of expand on that item a bit. The last piece I want to say around workforce development is that we're not only talking about individual activities, and this goes back to that definitional piece. Workforce development also sometimes refers to what is that entire ecosystem that supports the ability of different stakeholders within the labor market to carry out their functions. And in terms of a broader jurisdiction like Toronto, these kind of cross-cutting supports, whether it means we need the right labor market data, an analysis of that data, our ability to recruit across different populations, our ability to engage with employers in larger collectives. That means, working with various sector councils or industry associations or chambers of commerce. That it's not a one-to-one, but there's a mobilization of the collective bodies in order to support these initiatives, and the opportunity to plan, to have the individual workforce intermediaries being able to talk with each other to kind of identify what are their common issues, what are their common needs, as well as to then be able to advocate with funders, whether it's governments or other bodies, to be clear about what their specific concerns are. Just as an aside, I say, this part of workforce development was already something that was highlighted almost 20 years ago now in the City of Toronto's first labor force readiness plan. Okay, so very quickly, I also wanted to provide some labor market context for why we want to do this. And I want to focus on, especially if we're talking about individuals who are further from the labor market, we're looking at jobs that typically require a high school diploma or less. And this slide here, I wanted to show how, if we look at jobs by skill level in Toronto over the last 25 years, the share of all jobs that require only a high school diploma or less has dropped. In 1996, it was around 41%, and last year, or 2 years ago, it was around 34%. That's a very significant drop, and it's interesting because in the first 10 years or so, if we go from 1996 to around 2006 or so, or 8, we were seeing what we called an hourglass economy, which meant that the number of jobs were increasing at the two ends of the labor market. So the number of jobs that required a high school diploma or less were increasing, and the number of jobs that required a university degree or more were increasing. Well, that kind of, in Toronto, that stalled already around 10 years ago. And more recently, the growth has happened in jobs that require a university degree. So as you can see, went from 31% in 1996 to 39%. So not to say that the number of jobs that require a high school diploma or less has dropped. It's actually increased slightly, but our economy has grown, our labor force has grown, so the share of those jobs has decreased. But who's in those jobs? So of jobs that require high school or less, in 1996 in Toronto, 2/3 of those jobs were held by people who had a high school diploma or less, 66%. Okay? 25 years later, less than half of those jobs are held by individuals who have a high school diploma or less. So the people who are presumably matched to those jobs in terms of their education level, there are fewer of them in them. Now, a couple of things have happened. The proportion of people who have a high school or less has dropped. Okay, that's certainly the case. We've also graduated. We've put such an effort on university education that we've produced too many graduates, long and short of it. And there are not enough knowledge sector jobs to employ those individuals. So they've migrated to jobs that require a high school diploma or less. Employers may prefer those workers because they feel, well, they've had some kind of accomplishment, perhaps because they have a credential. But by the same token, I will say that some of these jobs that require a high school diploma or less, probably the skill requirements have increased to some extent. Certainly the expectations around understanding customer service and taking the initiative and so on and so forth. There has been an increase, the requirement, let's say, even for digital skills of a sort. But also, if the proportion of people who have a high school diploma or less has shrunk, the skill set within that population is probably also a somewhat diminished, because if one's having difficulty or have barriers to completing a college program or a university degree, and could be some attention deficit or some learning disability of another sort, we may also have that may be a higher need group, which also kind of just speaks to the need for a higher level of intervention in order to assist these people to come back and to succeed in the labor market. What has happened with this group in this slide, what I want to show, is this shows the participation rate. So participation rate is the proportion of a population who is either employed or actively looking for work. This shows the participation rate from, again, the last 25 years by individuals with a post-secondary degree, both males and females, and individuals with a high school diploma or less, both males and females. And I focused in on 25 to 44-year-olds because this is kind of the core working age group. Most of them are already finished whatever education they'd be doing, and they're not near retirement. So for those with a post-secondary degree, their participation rate has not changed. And we hear about the participation rate dropping overall, but that's because that's the total average. For those with a post-secondary degree, it's gone from 92% to 94% for males and 86 to 85%, 85% to 85% for females. But for those with a high school or less, it's dropped 7% for males and 10% by female. So they've just dropped out of the labor force, 25 to 44-year-olds. And I think this is for me, this is a shocking statistic that these individuals are actually not in the labor force, where we still have a large number of jobs for which they would be qualified. Okay, COVID. What happened during COVID? Here, I've got 3 lines. So these are the actual employment numbers, and these are annual figures. The orange line is people with a university degree. So from 2015 to 2020, the number of people in this category increased by 11%. The green line are those with a college or trade certificate. So they fell somewhat, 10%. I mean, it was pretty well flat, right? It didn't increase much until 2019. Then it falls roughly 10%. But the big drop in employment was among jobs that require a high school diploma or less. That had a 21% drop. Again, it was pretty well flat at around the 500,000 level. And then from 2019 to 2020, it drops 21%. And let me show you the figures by month, because it was really quite striking, because you can see the impact of COVID. So again, this is Toronto CMA. And here now I have broken it down by university, is the orange line, college or trade is the green line. Now I took high school, which is the red line, and the black line is no certificate. And in order to make it equivalent, I said, what was the level of employment in January 2020? And gave that a value of 100. And then how did that change over the months? Now, because this is very detailed data that's looking at education levels, when we go down to a smaller geography and into these subcategories, the labor force survey is not large enough as a survey to give a good sample month by month for these categories. So these also represent 3-month moving averages. So if we look at the bottom, we see January, February, March. March is when COVID hit, right? But the impact on a 3-month moving average only happens around a month or two later, because now you're averaging out the figures. Okay, so that's why it's kind of shifted a bit. But look at the drops. Like, well, look, maybe I should do it the other way. Look at who wasn't affected. Anyone in a job with a university degree, there was a bit of a drop. It went from like 100 to maybe 98. But then it's like, we're okay. Like, the figures just kept on rising. Whereas all the other categories, and especially those that a high school diploma, dropped to, almost lost 25% of their jobs in the first tranche, and in the second tranche, jobs that required no certificate. Okay. So the impact of COVID was so disproportionately felt by different groups. So I'm going to kind of summarize all this, okay? Because what are the implications when we're talking about workforce development in Toronto and the the service system manager jobs? I'm saying that, the impact, like what our labor market, the impact of our labor market has been, the outcomes for people with lower skills have not been good for a couple of decades. And COVID just kind of highlighted that for us, but there's nothing new about this story. The service system manager and Employment Ontario transformation is going to be focusing on those further from the labor market. And I'm saying that our employment services to date have not been very good at serving that segment of the population, which is why the argument of the paper is that we're going to have to focus more on the demand side, both to cultivate those relations with employers so they understand, the clients of workforce development, but also to help change some of the employer practices. It seems to me that there are good business arguments to be made to employers around the value of reducing their recruitment costs, their turnover costs, but that those better outcomes would also probably be well served by providing services to employers around. So how do you, what are some good supervisory practices around retaining employers? What are some things you might want to change about the job that we have studies show that would be of benefit to the employer? We're not only talking about how this job may improve someone's life, we're talking about how better human resources practices will have good outcomes for employers as well. for, in the paper that I did, I was trying to think, well, how do we mobilize some of this? And so I was trying to describe a process. I called it a table, but that there would be some value. We have a lot of stakeholders in the workforce development environment, and that the city, together with the community sector, with the nonprofit organizations, could convene a process to at least start developing an agenda around workforce development. It includes those ecosystem issues, such as what kind of data do we need? What kind of data still has to be collected? Are we appropriately connected, or are we all working on our individual silos? Is there a need for more information that crosses boundaries? And are there specific strategies we would want to undertake? I'm going to mention one that I really get excited about, and that's in London, England. The city has a definition of what they consider to be decent work. It is exceptionally detailed. It's like around a 130-page document. It talks about about the workplace, about recruitment, about equity, about career advancement. It covers all these different categories. And an employer can get designated or having met some of the criteria of what constitutes decent work, and that has an impact on what kind of decisions are made around procurement. Like, it's part of the procurement evaluation when it comes to city contracts and contracts with London Transport and London Police or London Fire Brigade and so on. The SSM conversation is a much more complicated one. And so for that one, I said, at this time, I said, there's value to having the city and the community sector talk about what options would they want to consider about how to address the question when the RFP comes for the service system manager. And I guess just to wrap it up, why this is important is it seems to me that economic development has, as from a municipal function, has often focused on the talent side. But we're at a stage now where employers are really wondering how and where they're going to be able to attract workers. They're expressing labor shortages. And so really in our day and age, the economy depends on a strong workforce, and workforce development should be seen as part and parcel as a component of economic development. But probably for starters, in order to take small steps, I think, perhaps the focus should be on small and medium-sized enterprises, because they're the ones who don't have the HR capabilities of the larger firms. And there may be some priority sectors that the city would want to focus on because of which are the important engines within the local economy. So that's the overview of the piece, and certainly look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you.
I think that's me. All right, that's me. So thanks to the ICE Committee for the invitation to come and share my reflections on workforce development in this recent report. And thank you, Tom, for setting the context and the challenge in the moment at time. So workforce development. I have to say, it took me a while to get acclimatized to this term. It can feel so opaque and abstract and somewhat clinical and jargony for something that I think so much of us that we're all so passionate about. So I'm going to share how I think of workforce development. To some, workforce development is a combination of social services, community supports, job training, and education that positions individuals for success in the workforce. This is the supply side. It's an individual-focused model that centers on training and education. Another side of this workforce development elephant is an organizational-centric perspective, the demand side, where training programs provide existing and potential workers with skills needed by employers to do the work, enabling their organizations to stay competitive. But there's also another side to workforce development, a society-centric perspective, where we educate and train individuals to meet the needs of current and future business and industry in order to maintain a sustainable, competitive economic environment. and might I add, a just and equitable society. And all three of these workforce development sides are not in tension with one another. It is not either or, but both and, like most complex things. These three workforce development paradigms are interconnected and interdependent. And I would suggest that while distinct, they do share the same purpose: growth. Not just economic growth, but I think prosperity. The shared purpose of prosperity, which I recently heard defined by the Senate Action Group on Prosperity, the Senate Prosperity Action Group, as prosperity equaling wealth plus well-being. So all three of these sides have growth, prosperity in common: wealth plus well-being. For me, these three sides of workforce development really crystallized where I finally saw what it looks like to work in unison during the 2019 Raptors championship run. For those that know me, I am a huge NBA fan. I watch every game that I get, and a huge Raptors fan as well. And if you remember the championship run, we saw all three sides of these workforce development paradigms working in unison. We saw the supply side, with sports commentators talking about the growth and talent of our players, this ragtag group of hardworking grinders winning a championship without a lottery pick on the roster. We saw the demand side, how Maple Leaf Sports Entertainment built the best talent development program in the NBA with excellent scouting, talent identification, and player development. And that investment still underpins the success of our Raptors franchise. Don't worry about last night, we'll be okay. And finally, we saw about what happens to us as a city, the economic ripples of success for business, hospitality, retail. But we also saw that we have become a basketball city. We're investing in building local basketball infrastructure to be a pipeline for current and future basketball talent. So this is a societal-centric side. And if you look at that, there is shared purpose at each one of these. Whether you are a player, a coach, a trader, an executive, a brand strategist, or a fan, it is not workforce development for workforce development's sake. It is about growth. It is about winning. So what should we do in Toronto then? To me, Maple Leaf Sports Entertainment demonstrates what an effective workforce development system looks like, and how an anchor organization is uniquely positioned to harness workforce development at all three levels. So Toronto, what do we do in our ecosystem, our workforce ecosystem of services and programs, policies and strategies that seek to prepare and place workers in careers fit for the current economy? How can we ensure that learners and workers and job candidates are trained and equipped to secure employment that enables prosperity? I offer three thoughts, and these echo what Tom's recommendations and framing in the paper are. And I recognize that my vantage point in this workforce development ecosystem is somewhat unique. I straddle both policy and practice with independent, stable dollars and long-term horizons that enable Metcalf to be strategy-driven rather than compliance-driven. And I work not only in philanthropy, funding grants that improve the economic livelihoods of low-income people in Toronto, but in strategic philanthropy, where I get to advance long-term strategies that create sustainable economic opportunities and community wealth, investing in system-level interventions that strengthen workforce development to be more effective as a poverty reduction strategy. So my three thoughts. Thought one, we need workforce development at all levels to focus on good jobs, like Tom said. And all jobs should be good jobs. Job quality has never been more important. It makes no sense, and I personally think it is morally wrong, that you can work full-time and still be living in entrenched poverty. COVID has shown us that all jobs are critical for our wealth and well-being. Cleaners, couriers, clerks, and C-suite. We are all interconnected, and work should provide dignity, stability, and sufficiency. COVID has shown us that our care economy is underpinned by low-wage work, although it is neither low-skilled nor low-valued. And our future health depends on these workers. Thought 2, we need to better coordinate and integrate this patchwork pipeline of workforce development programs and services, as Tom has identified. Prosperity has never been more important. There are people looking for work for the first time in decades, people who have never been unemployed this long, people who need to return to work after exhausting all of their savings, people who need work for status and residency, people who want to work, but not at poverty wages and at the cost of their well-being, and gig workers and temp workers who've been working this whole time, grueling in low-wage jobs with no opportunity for advancement. We need all hands on deck across our system so that jobs that do not require a high school degree are not be taken up by college grads and seasoned professionals who just need to pay the rent. We need to coordinate and strategize in how we can best enable the most vulnerable and marginalized in our labor market to thrive with economic dignity. Final thought, thought 3. Coordinating our pipeline is not sufficient. We need to connect the dots between our workforce systems, these different sides of this workforce development elephant. We need an orchestration strategy. We need to bring coherence to our fragmented but interdependent interventions: workforce development, economic development, small business support, adult literacy, lifelong learning, social assistance, and life stabilization. We need an orchestration strategy to bring coherence to our fragmented but interdependent funding envelopes: federal, provincial, municipal, philanthropic, and all the ministries and departments in between, in order to generate long-term outcomes, which is shared prosperity, wealth, and well-being. So colleagues, this is our challenge. And I think, as Tom mentioned, it's something that's never been more prevalent than now, because sometimes we need to be reminded of hopeful visions of the future. I offer this last thought. Plus, I can't imagine not adding my 2 cents to the Employment Ontario Service System Manager, or that would be the elephant in the room. I say this: we can do this as a workforce system. We can change our systems with patience, collaboration, vision, and strategy, and the critical ingredient, trust. The employment services transformation will change our workforce system. It will change actors, interactions, structures, resource flows, policies, standards, roles, and relationships, and definitely, I'm sure, our database management system. I think the city and community has both shared interest and shared need. I think we hold a shared vision that employment services needs to be human-centered, community-based, and both social purpose and nonprofit driven. So let this be our We the North moment. Let us find common cause to advance a workforce development agenda for the City of Toronto that is inclusive and local and strengthens our economy for prosperity for all. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Adriana and Tom. Great presentations. And Adriana, thank you very much for your reflection. I certainly feel like the passion behind that. And you've posed some very good questions out to our audience with respect to some of the challenges I think we have in terms of making this happen, these thought-provoking kind of vision statements that you've put forward. So thank you for your comments and your reflections. I'm going to remind the audience, I believe we have a little over maybe 60 participants on the line, to use the question submission feature that appears, I believe, Judy, if it's on the right of people's screen, if I remember that correctly, to use that function to submit your questions. I will be monitoring my email in case you have any questions, comments, and if you have specific comments in reaction to what Tom has shared today or what Adriana has shared, please specify, and I will certainly make note of those questions that come in. So to kick things off, I had a few questions of my own, and I'm actually wondering if maybe we want to start there and allow folks to kind of, for the questions to trickle in. So I'm glad to hear, Adriana, your comments about this being, the last point you made around connecting the dots and an orchestration strategy. It's really important to kind of consider not just the role that the city government plays in this, but the role of funders, various funders, the role of program deliverers, and how everybody needs to come together. And it's not just about the quality of the programs, it's about the cohesion across these various forms of investment. So just to comment, and I guess this is a question to Adriana and Tom, today's presentation obviously provided great food for thought and foundational information. What are some other critical, platforms that you think we should be going out to share this information? Who else needs to know about this? If we could wave Tom's report around, who should we wave it in front of? Are there other spaces that we should be targeting for these kinds of conversations to happen?
Sure. I think part of that is like everyone needs to see themselves as part of workforce development. This is sometimes we use different language to describe the same thing, but I think it's an important thing to say to different levels of government. I think it's a really important conversation with the college system and what continuing ed looks like. And so part of that is, how does workforce development work across the board? How do we work with industry councils and develop better relationships with employers? But I think this is a big change management process. How do we take what we do and try to do it differently? And I think many things have to be, 2018 is a world away. And now we have to think about, what does this look like going forward? How do we triage this economy and this labor market in a really critical way? And how do we make sure that, we don't just focus on the creaming of the top, but really recognize that people have been really far removed from the labor market, that as Tom said, how long people are stopping looking for work, how long people have been unemployed and underemployed. And we can see in society what happens when we begin to neglect and forget that responsibility for our workforce system.
Great, thanks, Adriana. Tom, any thoughts?
Well, I certainly echo what Adriana says. I think a great challenge, again, given some of the things I've been talking about, is what's the best interface with employers, and I think that's been a challenge for us in Toronto for some time around where does that conversation take place, and I'd suggest that some of it has to do with the tendency to focus on talent, the way I described it. And I think maybe the challenge for us is to express the issue of workforce development across a broader set of the workforce as something that is also, a necessary piece of the puzzle for the kind of economic prosperity that we want to achieve in the future.
Great, thanks, Tom. Okay, so I'm starting to see some questions trickle in, so I'm going to address a few of them. So a question here about the main point of this presentation. Is it turning an, in quotations, employment assistance outlook into workforce development, which is more comprehensive and holds every side, seekers and employers, accountable?
I think what it is employment services is the system we have, and the service system manager will, a lot of it will maintain a lot of that system. I think there are opportunities to change the model, but in terms of what the expectation is of job seekers it is that they will have help in terms of connecting them to jobs. What I'm saying is that I think the workforce development piece can be a much more integral part of that equation, and that we need to see how the outcomes of employment services are linked up with workforce development objectives, because I think again, and as Adriana says, like, we've been operating, it's been fragmented, and we need to find the process for ensuring that those are complementary goals, because they each support each other. The workforce development does rely on employment services, but I think especially in terms of what the objectives are of the SSM, it's going to need a lot more workforce development support. And I don't want to oversell workforce development. I don't want to say that somehow it's a silver bullet, but I think without an enhanced workforce development component, I really question whether the SSM would be able to deliver what the expectations are under the current provincial regime. I think the way it's been structured.
I would just add to sense on that of, employment services is is a huge underlying infrastructure. And I think it's an important infrastructure that many things can be built on. But perhaps if you think of it like as a knife, it's just a blunt instrument on its own. But when you use that with like a fork and other things and you have a meal, it's amazing what you can do with it. So employment services on its own in isolation, it's not that necessarily effective all on its own, but woven into a range of things. I don't think, like, none of us underestimate a really good resume, some support for having to go through an interview, how to tell your story of your employment and labor history. Like, employment services and supply side stuff is really critical, but in isolation, it's just a blunt instrument. So the exciting part of this moment is how do we connect it, and how can community in the city that leverage so many assets together see the meal they could prepare and eat together.
I am loving these analogies. So we're going for the feast is what I'm hearing. So thanks, Adriana, for that. And I also really do want to, shine light on what you've said previously. I really liked your framing about sort of the third prong to workforce development. I haven't quite heard it expressed in that way before with respect to the societal kind of impacts and the focus on prosperity and the tie-ins to poverty reduction goals. So thank you for that. That really is important to keep in mind, particularly as we think about who the system is set up to serve and who is bearing, I think, the greatest impact of all of this. So thank you for that framing. I have one other question here. Sorry, one second. So this is a question for Tom. What should the role of the province be in workforce development? And how do we ensure local needs are met, specifically around labor market information? So perhaps maybe a couple of questions in there, but role of the province in workforce development, how do we ensure local needs are met, and specifically around labor market information?
So I think it's hard to develop a workforce development strategy at a provincial level that has enough specificity to it that one can see how it applies locally. One of the things I'm very conscious of because of the labor market analysis work that I do with all the data is just how different Toronto is from the rest of the province. And we have various systems in place, including workforce planning boards that aggregate the perspectives of communities and employers to identify local labor market challenges. I think the larger the jurisdiction, the harder it is to do that. And I'm not sure we've figured that out yet. But I do think that part of it is the kind of process I was describing. I think one of the values of bringing together the very disparate range of stakeholders in workforce development through a process in Toronto would be precisely that, to say, this is what is necessary here in Toronto in order to advance workforce development. This is how perhaps the SSM should interface with a workforce development strategy that's developed locally. And that kind of model has application elsewhere, but each locality, each catchment area could go through that similar process, because I don't think one can expect the SSM to develop that on its own. It's going to have enough challenges trying to put in place the transformation that's taking place just in terms of the services and the absorption of the OW employment services and so on. So I don't think we would see a strategy come out as much as just a service program design. So I think it's something that that can be developed locally and then provided to the province.
Wondering, Tom, if you have any thoughts specifically around labor market information. Didn't want to lose sight of that piece.
Well, I think it's much the same, because I think it varies. I think the problem is that we're often talking about how we need more labor market information. I think the unfortunate thing is that we have a fair bit of labor market information. A lot of it isn't even, we don't spend enough time analyzing it or applying it to the particular issue or challenge we have. I think the problem with labor market information that it is so, when it's aggregated at a large level, you can't see what's happening to the individual components. So for example, just when I gave that data about participation rates, it was a surprise to me, because I had always thought, I keep hearing how participation rates are slowly declining, but it really has to do with unpacking who is, where is it happening? And when we start seeing that, as I said, individuals with high school education, core working age are dropping out of the labor force. This is pre-COVID. And it's been a long time trend. I think that's got to be a concern. And in each jurisdiction, there'd be different issues about it. In other places, it's aging population. In other places, it's out-migration. So it's zeroing in on the specific issue of a particular locale, as opposed to the kind of the broad accumulation of a lot of labor market information, in my view.
Great, thanks, Tom. I did have a sort of a question related to that, or more of a comment around the drop off of females with less than high school, and some of the scarring implications for this segment of the population. I know there's been a lot of literature around NEET youth, and I wonder if there are some sort of comparisons that could be made with respect to interventions and thinking around that particular group, and designing sort of some specific programming or solutions around meeting those specific needs. So thanks for raising it. I think very important implications that you've raised. For program makers and designers here on the line. I think that is all the time we have for questions. I wanted to express my deepest thanks to Adriana and Tom for your thought-provoking presentations and reflections today. And to the audience, thank you for tuning in virtually. Definitely a new way of working, and I appreciate your time today. I'm going to hand it over to Judy, who will close off today's event. Thank you all.
Thanks so much, Christine, Tom, and Adriana. I thought today's session was really interesting. If you haven't already downloaded Tom's report, I encourage you to do that, because he gave highlights today, which are a great summary. The depth of analysis in the report is really, really also interesting. I'll just take a minute to note that all of the work that ICE does is public and free. So we will be posting the webcast of today's session, as well as Tom's slides on our website, where people can reach it and download it at any time in the future, and also forward it on to others who may have missed the webcast that you think would be interested in hearing it. So it will live on after today's session. If anyone has any follow-up questions as they mull over what's been said today, I encourage you to send them to us, and we'll try to get them answered by Tom and Adriana or Christine. You can send them to info@icecommittee.org. And we watch that email constantly. Also, that's a good email to use if you want more information about the work that our committee does. And last but not least, I want to encourage you all to fill out your feedback form so that we know kind of what your reactions were to today's session and your suggestions for other topics that we might focus on at future events. We usually do about 2 events a year, and then we usually commission a research project is kind of the level of activity that we support. So thank you so much. I look forward to seeing who was able to participate today. I will be back in touch with all registrants by email, probably next week, where I'll give you the links and as I say, invite your questions and so forth again. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.